If you like romantic stories, you're in the right place. So please subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and hit the bell for more videos. In a world where every secret had a lock, and every lock had a code, there was one man who believed he had created the unbreakable fortress. He was a magnate in the digital security empire, the architect of invisible walls that shielded governments, corporations, and the wealthiest individuals from the chaos of the online world. His reputation was built on certainty, an aura of invincibility that surrounded both his company and himself. To him, numbers were not just numbers, they were guardians. Codes were not mere sequences, they were promises of safety, and he had dedicated his life to ensuring that no one could ever slip through his defenses. But perfection, as he would soon discover, has a way of cracking at the seams when you least expect it. It happened on a night like any other. He was sitting in his private office, the city lights sprawling beneath him like a digital circuit board, every building glowing as though it were connected to the pulse of technology. His desk was immaculate, his monitors arranged like sentinels keeping watch over a world of endless data streams. He thrived on control, on order, on the comforting silence of knowing his systems were untouchable. Until that silence was broken. It began with a flicker, just a tremor on one of his screens, a small anomaly that could have been dismissed as a glitch. But glitches did not exist in his world. Every line of code had been reviewed, tested, and fortified against the most persistent threats. He leaned closer, his sharp eyes narrowing, and the faint trace of an intrusion began to reveal itself, an elegant thread of code weaving through his fortress like a ghost passing through locked doors. At first, he thought it was impossible. No hacker had ever gotten this far before. The strongest governments had tried to test his systems, rival companies had poured millions into trying to crack his firewalls, and yet none had succeeded. He had built walls so high and moats so deep that even the most determined cyber intruders had always drowned in their own arrogance. But tonight, someone had crossed the impossible boundary. Someone had found a way in. His chest tightened, a mix of fury and intrigue rising in equal measure. He called up layers of defense, activated emergency barriers, unleashed counter-programs that had been waiting like loyal soldiers for the call to arms. Yet, the intruder moved with agility, as though anticipating his every move. It was not brute force, this was artistry. The lines of code were not random attacks, they were brushstrokes, deliberate and precise, painting a pattern across his system. Whoever was behind this intrusion wasn't just skilled, they were brilliant. Minutes turned into hours as he tracked the breach, his fingers gliding over the keyboard with the precision of a concert pianist. He was not a man accustomed to losing, and the thought of being outsmarted ignited something dangerous in him. His empire, his reputation, his entire identity rested on the belief that he was untouchable. And yet, here was someone dancing through his walls as though they were made of paper. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the attack stopped. The code froze in place, suspended like a signature left behind after a performance. He scrolled through it, his eyes darting across the screen, and then he saw it. A message. It wasn't threatening. It wasn't demanding ransom. It wasn't political. It was simply playful. A short line of text woven into the code left like a whisper in the dark. I just wanted to see if you'd notice. For the first time in years, he felt his lips curve into something between a scowl and a reluctant smile. This wasn't an ordinary hacker. This was someone who didn't care about money, power, or chaos. This was someone who wanted his attention, someone who dared to poke the lion in his den, not to harm him, but to be seen by him. The discovery unsettled him more than any act of cyber warfare could have. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the glowing words on his screen. Who would do such a thing? And more importantly, why him? The hours that followed were restless. He could not bring himself to leave the office, replaying every detail of the breach, analyzing every elegant curve of the code. There was something almost intimate about it, as though the intruder had left a fingerprint not just on his system, but on him. He had spent years in a world of cold logic and rigid defenses, but now, for the first time, He felt as though someone had touched him through the very thing he had always trusted to protect him. He could still hear the hum of the servers, steady and loyal as if nothing had happened. But inside him everything had shifted. The fortress was no longer flawless, and in the breach there was a pulse, a sign of life, of connection, of something he could not yet name. As dawn began to paint the horizon outside his window, he made a silent vow. Whoever this hacker was, he would find her, not to punish her, not yet, but because he needed to know who could outwit him in his own kingdom, and why her message felt less like a threat and more like an invitation. The perfect system had been breached, and with it, so had his heart, though he didn't know it yet. The message haunted him. "I just wanted to see if you'd notice." Those words lingered in his mind like a song he couldn't stop replaying, echoing through the silence of his penthouse office and even into the solitude of his home. He had faced governments, corporations, and rivals who had all tried to shatter his systems with brute force, and yet none of them had left him feeling this way. This was different. This wasn't about power. It wasn't about money. It wasn't even about rebellion. It was about attention, his attention. Whoever she was, she had chosen him. He found himself drawn back to the glowing screens every night, combing through the fragments of her code as if they were pieces of a puzzle that might reveal her face. Each line carried her essence, the precision of her logic, the daring creativity of her movements, the playful way she twisted through barriers that had been designed to be impenetrable. There was a rhythm to her intrusion, almost like music written in numbers, a melody only he could hear. And though he would never admit it aloud, he was captivated. But obsession is a dangerous fire. For every trace of admiration that flickered in him, there was an equal measure of fury. How dare she enter his kingdom? How dare she break into the fortress he had built with his very soul? He was a man of control, and nothing slipped past him without consequence. And yet, she had slipped past, not only into his system, but into his thoughts. So he began the hunt. Night after night, he followed her digital footprints, combing through dark corners of the net, analyzing the residue of her brilliance. Unlike other hackers, she didn't cover her tracks entirely. No, she left just enough behind, as if she wanted him to follow. It was infuriating and exhilarating all at once, like a game of cat and mouse, except he could not decide who was the predator and who was the prey. The more he searched, the clearer her signature became. Not her name, not her location, but her style. Every hacker had a rhythm, a way of writing code that was as personal as handwriting, as distinct as a fingerprint. Hers was unlike anything he had ever seen before, sharp yet elegant, mischievous yet purposeful. She was bold, leaving little sparks of herself in places no one else would notice. But he did. Always, he noticed. And then came the second message. It appeared one evening as he scanned his system for vulnerabilities she might have exploited. Buried deep inside a decoy folder, as if she knew exactly where he would look, he found another line of text, glowing against the black screen. "You're faster than I thought." His pulse quickened. She wasn't just hacking him, she was communicating with him. This was no accident, no reckless intrusion. It was intentional, deliberate, almost intimate. She wasn't running from him. She was leading him. He should have been enraged. He should have unleashed the full power of his resources to track her down and crush her anonymity. But instead, he found himself smiling. He hadn't felt this alive in years. Every move she made pulled him deeper into her orbit. She was out there somewhere, watching him, teasing him, daring him to come closer. And he would. He began to notice patterns, late-night activity, certain digital haunts she frequented, forums disguised as forgotten corners of the net, encrypted chat rooms where shadows spoke in riddles. She was always careful, always cloaked, but her brilliance made her shine even when she tried to stay invisible. The irony of it struck him. She had invaded his world to get his attention, but now she had his full attention in a way that went beyond the screen. He imagined her sometimes, sitting in a dimly lit room, her face illuminated by the glow of a monitor, her fingers moving gracefully over the keyboard as she wrote the lines of code that would bring him to her. What kind of person would do this? What kind of heart would risk angering the most powerful man in digital security? not for profit, not for revenge, but for connection. The thought unsettled him more than he cared to admit. For years he had been surrounded by people who feared him, respected him, or needed him. No one had ever dared to play with him. No one had ever risked provoking his wrath just to be seen. And yet, she had. One evening, as he traced another thread of her code, he found something unusual. It wasn't a message this time, but a mark, an encrypted symbol, delicate and intricate, hidden within the folds of his system like a signature. He decrypted it slowly, layer by layer, until the pattern revealed itself. It was a simple design, almost like a heart, crafted out of numbers and letters. His breath caught. A hacker had left her heart in his system. The magnitude of it struck him in ways he couldn't explain. It wasn't just clever, it was intimate. In a world of cold firewalls and ruthless algorithms, she had left behind something soft, something human. She had breached not just his defenses, but his loneliness. For the first time, he wondered if this wasn't a game at all. What if it was a message in its purest form? What if this mysterious intruder wasn't just testing his skills, but reaching out from her solitude to his? The question lodged itself deep in his chest. He spent days chasing her ghost across the network, but she always stayed just out of reach, leaving trails of light like a comet passing through the night sky. Sometimes she would let him come close, almost close enough to see her fully, and then vanish, leaving only a whisper of code behind. Each encounter left him more determined, more restless, more consumed by the idea of her. It was madness, he knew. She was a hacker, an enemy technically, a trespasser who had dared to touch what was his. And yet, he couldn't deny the truth that was forming inside him. She was no longer just a threat. She was a mystery, a spark in a world that had long since gone dark for him. He began to live for the nights when she would appear again, leaving him messages in the form of elegant codes, riddles only he could solve. Their connection deepened not through words, not through faces, but through the silent intimacy of numbers and keys. She wasn't just hacking his system anymore, she was hacking him. And though he hadn't yet seen her face, he already knew one thing for certain. Whoever this anonymous hacker was, she had already breached something far more guarded than his security empire. She had breached his heart. For weeks he had chased her ghost through the endless corridors of the digital world, each message she left, drawing him deeper into the labyrinth she had created for them both. She was no longer just an intruder. She had become a presence, unseen, untouchable, yet impossibly near. He could feel her eyes on him in the glow of his monitors, could sense her laughter hidden behind her lines of code, could almost hear the quick rhythm of her heartbeat whenever she allowed him to come dangerously close to uncovering her. But the game had to end. For a man like him, control was not negotiable. He had built his empire on dominance, on knowing more than anyone else, on staying steps ahead of every opponent. And yet, she had turned him into a pursuer. She had reversed the roles, forcing him to play the hunter in a game where she dictated the rules. And though part of him thrilled at the chase, another part demanded resolution. He needed to see her. He needed to confront the girl who had dared to breach not only his system, but his composure. So he prepared his move. It took nights of restless analysis, tracing her habits through the faintest echoes she left behind. Unlike other hackers who hid behind layers of stolen identities, she left hints, subtle, deliberate, as though she wanted him to find her, but only when he proved himself worthy. He followed those clues with the precision of a man obsessed, cross-referencing time zones, tracking the rhythm of her activity, even catching the slight pauses in her code that hinted at the moments when she stepped away from her screen. Then, finally, he found her. Not her name, not yet, but her location. A quiet corner of the city, hidden behind the facade of an ordinary apartment building, the kind that thousands walked past every day without a second glance. But for him, it pulsed like a beacon. Behind those walls was the girl who had undone the fortress of his pride. The night he decided to confront her, the city was drenched in rain. Streets glistened with reflections of neon lights, cars hissed past like restless spirits, and the air smelled of electricity. He wore no suit, no armor of power, only a dark coat, his expression carved from determination. He wasn't going as the untouchable magnate tonight. He was going as a man who demanded answers. When he reached the building, he hesitated only once, his hand on the cold metal of the entrance door. What if she wasn't what he imagined? What if the brilliance of her code did not match the person behind it? And worse, what if meeting her destroyed the fragile electric tension that had bound them together across the invisible lines of cyberspace? But he pushed the thought away. He needed to see her. He moved through the hallway, silent as a shadow, until he stood before the door. Her door. For a moment, he simply listened. There was the faint hum of a computer, the soft clatter of keys being pressed, the rhythm of someone lost in her own world. He lifted his hand and knocked. The typing stopped. There was silence, heavy and charged, as if the entire world held its breath. Then, slowly, the door opened, and there she was. You never forget the first time you see someone who has already changed your life. She wasn't what he expected, yet somehow she was exactly what he had imagined. Young, but not naive. Her eyes burned with intelligence, sharp and mischievous, carrying the same spark he had seen in her code. She wore no mask, no pretense, only the quiet confidence of someone who knew she had been waiting for this moment. You found me, she said softly, a smile tugging at her lips. The sound of her voice startled him. After weeks of silence, of staring at words on a screen, hearing her was like stepping into a new world. He narrowed his eyes, studying her, his anger and fascination colliding in the storm of his chest. Do you realize what you've done? His voice was low, dangerous, but beneath it ran a current he couldn't control, something dangerously close to awe. She tilted her head, her gaze unflinching. I broke into your system, I left you a message, and you came. Her audacity struck him like lightning. Anyone else would have begged for mercy, but she stood there, calm and unafraid, as if she had expected his fury and welcomed it. Why? He demanded, stepping closer. Why me? Why my system? Do you have any idea what I could do to you? She smiled then, not mocking, not reckless, just certain. I didn't want your money, I didn't want your secrets. I wanted your attention. And I knew the only way to get it was to break into the one thing you thought no one could touch. Her words cut through him, deeper than any weapon could. Attention. The thing he gave so sparingly, the thing people around him fought for and never truly earned. And yet, she had claimed it, not by asking, but by daring. For you risked everything, he said, almost to himself. For this. For you, she whispered. The room seemed to shrink around them. He could hear the rain hammering against the windows, the hum of her computer still alive in the background. But all he could see was her, the girl who had turned his world inside out. His fury should have burned hotter, but instead, something else rose within him. Something dangerous, something intoxicating. You're reckless, he muttered. You're predictable, she countered, her eyes glinting with defiance. The silence that followed was electric, heavy with the weight of everything unsaid. He had come here to confront her, to put an end to her intrusion. But standing before her, he realized the truth he had been trying to ignore. She was not his enemy. She was his equal. And for a man who had lived his life untouchable, that was more terrifying than any hack could ever be. He should have walked away. He should have called the authorities, ended this game, restored the order of his world. But instead, he found himself stepping closer, drawn into the gravity of her presence. She didn't flinch, didn't step back. She stood her ground, as though she had known all along that this was where their paths would lead. For the first time, he saw not the hacker, not the intruder, but the girl. And in her eyes, he saw the reflection of himself. Not the magnate, not the fortress, but the man who had been waiting unknowingly for someone to breach his heart. The confrontation had begun, but it was not a battle, it was the beginning of something neither of them could control. When he first stood in her doorway, the tension between them had been like the sharp edge of a blade, dangerous, electric, impossible to ignore. He had come for answers, for control, for closure. But what he found in her eyes was something he couldn't name, something that unsettled him far more than the breach itself. She had admitted it boldly. She wanted his attention. Not his wealth, not his secrets, not his power, just him. It was a confession so simple, so audacious, that it had left him disarmed. He had spent his entire life surrounded by people who wanted something from him. Alliances, contracts, influence, security. No one ever wanted just him. And yet, the girl who had shattered his digital walls stood before him, unflinching, and claimed exactly that. But he knew there was more. There had to be more. The days after their confrontation blurred into something he had never experienced before. Instead of ending her game, he found himself returning to her world, to the small apartment lit by the constant glow of screens, to the quiet rhythm of her voice that filled the silence he had always carried with him. He told himself it was curiosity, that he needed to understand her mind, to know how she had done the impossible. But deep down, he knew it wasn't just about the code anymore. It was about her. And so, little by little, she began to unravel before him. Not through confessions, not through direct words, but through the subtle ways her eyes softened when she spoke of her work, through the lingering pauses in her sentences when she wanted to say more but hesitated, through the small, almost invisible cracks in her armor that revealed she wasn't just a hacker, she was human and fragile and carrying a story she had yet to tell. One night, as rain traced patterns on her window and her screens glowed softly around them, he asked her the question that had been gnawing at him since the moment they met. Why me? His voice was low, steady, but beneath it was the quiet ache of a man who needed to know. Of all the systems you could have breached, of all the people you could have provoked, why mine? She looked at him, then really looked at him, and for a moment he saw something flicker across her face, something vulnerable, something raw. She leaned back in her chair, her hands resting loosely on the keyboard, her gaze fixed not on her screens, but on him. Because, she said softly, I knew you'd notice. He frowned, confused. That can't be all. A faint smile tugged at her lips, but it wasn't playful this time. It was sad, almost wistful. Do you know what it's like to be invisible? To live in a world where you can walk past 1,000 people and not one of them sees you? To spend your days behind screens, building worlds of numbers and firewalls, only to realize that outside of them you're nothing more than a shadow? Her words struck him with unexpected force. She continued, her voice steady but laced with something fragile. I watched you from a distance for a long time. Not the magnate everyone fears, not the man in the newspapers, but you. The way you disappear into your work, the way you hide behind the walls you've built. You're seen by the world but not truly known. And I thought, maybe you'd understand me. Maybe in some strange way, we're the same. The admission silenced him. He had always been surrounded by power, by recognition, by the weight of his reputation. But recognition was not the same as being seen. People admired him, feared him, depended on him, but no one ever truly saw him, not until her. And now, in her words, he recognized the mirror of his own solitude. You risked everything for that, he asked quietly. She nodded. Because for once I didn't want to be invisible. Not to you. The simplicity of her confession shook him more than any intrusion ever could. She hadn't breached his system for glory, or rebellion, or even challenge. She had done it because she wanted him to notice her existence, to pull her out of the shadows she had lived in for so long. It wasn't just attention she wanted, it was connection. And he, who had spent his life building walls, found himself wanting to be the one who let her in. In the nights that followed, he found himself learning more about her, not through interrogation but through presence. She spoke of her childhood in fragments, of always being the outlier, the one who saw the world in numbers and patterns when everyone else saw it in colors and shapes. She spoke of how she taught herself to code, how the digital world became her refuge, her language, her way of existing when the real world had no place for her. And then one night, she said something that stayed with him forever. You built your system to keep people out, she murmured, her fingers tracing absent patterns on the desk. I broke into it to prove that even the strongest walls can't protect you from being alone. Her words were both a challenge and a plea, and he couldn't ignore them. For the first time in his life, he began to question the foundation of everything he had built. His empire, his reputation, his fortress of firewalls. What good were they if at the end of the day they left him isolated, unreachable, untouched? In her vulnerability he found his own, and in that hidden motive, the simple, desperate desire not to be invisible, he found something far greater than anger or fascination. He found the beginning of something he hadn't dared to hope for in years: connection. Love written not in roses or poetry, but in the quiet lines of code that had first brought her to him, and in the silent, fragile moments where their solitude finally found its match. The hidden motive was no longer hidden. It was laid bare between them, fragile and undeniable. And for the first time, he no longer wanted to rebuild the walls she had broken. He wanted to leave them open. He had spent his entire life mastering the art of control. Every decision calculated, every risk anticipated, every threat neutralized before it could even reach his walls. Control was the core of his empire, the armor that shielded him from failure, from weakness, from anyone who dared to challenge his authority. But with her, control was slipping. It wasn't just the fact that she had breached his unbreakable system. It wasn't just the daring of her messages, the way she had forced him into a chase he had never asked for. It was her, the girl behind the code, the way she looked at him without fear, the way her words cut past his defenses and went straight to the man he had long buried beneath layers of power and pride. And it infuriated him. Every time he stood in her presence, a war erupted inside him. One part of him burned with anger. How dare she invade his life, unravel his certainty, make him question everything he thought was untouchable. But another part of him, one he could neither silence nor deny, was drawn to her like gravity. Her brilliance fascinated him. Her audacity captivated him. Her vulnerability disarmed him. He wanted to hate her. He wanted to punish her. He wanted to lock her out forever. And yet he wanted her closer. The contradiction gnawed at him day and night. In the quiet of his penthouse, he replayed their conversations, every glance, every defiant smile, every moment where her eyes had softened and revealed something fragile beneath her confidence. He told himself it was strategy, that understanding her was the key to regaining his control, but the truth was simpler and far more dangerous. He couldn't stop thinking about her. Their encounters became a pattern. He would arrive at her apartment unannounced, his presence filling the small space like a storm. She would greet him with that knowing smile, as if she had been expecting him all along. They would argue, he, furious at her recklessness, she unapologetic, daring him to admit what he really felt. Their words clashed like swords, sharp and unrelenting, yet always carrying an undercurrent neither of them wanted to name. "How you don't understand the danger you've put yourself in," he would growl, pacing the room like a caged animal. "And you don't understand what it's like to finally be seen," she would reply, her voice calm, her eyes unyielding. Every argument left him more unsettled. She refused to be intimidated, refused to submit to his authority, refused to play by the rules of fear that everyone else followed around him. And instead of breaking the tension, it only fueled it, stoking the fire that burned between them. It was a fire that frightened him, because it wasn't just anger anymore. One evening, as the city pulsed outside with neon lights and restless rain, their argument reached a breaking point. He had cornered her, demanding once again to know why she had chosen him, why she had risked everything for his attention. She stood her ground, her voice steady, her gaze unwavering. "Because you needed me as much as I needed you," she said simply. The words hit him like a blow. He opened his mouth to refute her, to deny it, but nothing came. Because deep down he knew it was true. He had been living behind walls for so long, surrounded by power but starved of connection. And she, reckless and brilliant, had torn those walls down with a single act of defiance. The air between them crackled, heavy and charged. Their anger, their fascination, their unspoken desire. It all collided in that moment, impossible to contain. He stepped closer, his breath sharp, his eyes locked on hers. She didn't move. She didn't retreat. She stood there, daring him with her silence, daring him to make a choice. For a heartbeat, time froze. And then, without thought, without control, he closed the distance. Their lips met in a clash that was not tender, not gentle, but fierce. Born of weeks of tension, of fury turned into fire, of fascination igniting into something neither of them could deny. It was a kiss that felt like battle and surrender all at once, anger melting into passion, resistance unraveling into need. When they pulled apart, breathless, the world seemed altered. The storm outside raged on, but inside, everything had shifted. He stared at her, his chest heaving, his mind reeling with the realization of what had just happened. She looked back at him, her lips curved in that infuriating, intoxicating smile. "Still angry?" she whispered. His laugh was low, unsteady, laced with something he hadn't felt in years. Always. But the anger was no longer just fury. It was something deeper, something that bound them instead of tearing them apart. From that night on, their dynamic changed. The arguments didn't stop. They still clashed, still pushed each other to the edge. But beneath every word was the undeniable current of desire. Their anger had become a language, their fascination the translation. Every confrontation brought them closer, every spark of defiance lighting the path towards something they could no longer escape. He had thought the breach of his system was the greatest threat he had ever faced, but now he knew the truth. The real danger was her. Because she had done what no one else had ever managed to do, she had breached his heart, and no firewall could ever keep her out again. From the very beginning, their connection had been written not in ordinary words, but in codes, encrypted, hidden, tucked behind walls of firewalls and algorithms. What began as an intrusion had become something else entirely, something no security system could anticipate, something no calculation could contain. It was love, but love born in the most unusual of ways. He had built his empire on logic, on flawless design, on systems that never bent, never broke, never allowed the mess of human error to interfere. And yet, here he was, undone by a girl who had slipped through every defense, not just his digital fortress, but the fortress around his heart. The days after their first kiss unfolded like a dream he didn't know he wanted to live in. There was no neat script for what they were becoming. One moment they were still clashing, he with his pride, she with her stubborn independence. The next, they were sharing quiet silences, stolen glances, and words that carried more weight than either dared to admit. She filled his sterile world with a kind of chaos he had always feared, yet found himself craving. Her laughter echoed in rooms that had only known the hum of machines. Her questions poked holes in his rigid routines, forcing him to rethink not just his systems but his life. And every time she smiled at him, that unguarded, genuine smile, he felt something break free inside him, something he thought he had buried long ago. But it wasn't easy. He still wrestled with the truth of what they were. The man who had once seen vulnerability as weakness now found himself lying awake at night, wondering if he could ever be enough for her. She, in turn, questioned what it meant to be tied to someone like him, a man of power, a man feared by many, a man who had built walls so high that she had been the first and maybe the only to climb them. Their love was not soft. It was sharp-edged, messy, unpredictable. It lived in the space between arguments and apologies, between stubborn silences and tender touches. One evening, as they sat together in his penthouse, the glow of computer screens casting shifting light across the room, she looked at him and said almost teasingly, "Do you know why I chose your system to break into?" He raised an eyebrow. Already knowing the answer had little to do with logic. "Because it was the most secure in the world?" She shook her head with a grin. "Because I knew it was guarded by someone who had forgotten what it meant to let anyone in." Her words struck deeper than any line of code ever could. He looked at her then, really looked at her, the girl who had risked everything just to be seen by him. And for the first time, he didn't feel fear in the thought of letting someone that close. He felt relief. That night, he took her into his private server room, the heart of his empire, a place no one else had ever stepped foot in. Towering racks of blinking lights surrounded them, the quiet hum of power filling the air like a heartbeat. "This," he said softly, his voice reverberating in the cold, sterile space, "is the one place I've never shared with anyone. Every secret, every key, every piece of me I've hidden from the world, it's all here." She looked around, eyes wide, then turned back to him with a tenderness that melted the weight in his chest. "And now you're sharing it with me?" He nodded. "Because you're the only one I trust to hold it." In that moment, Surrounded by circuits and code, he reached for her hand. It was warm, human, fragile, so unlike the cold perfection of the machines around them. And when her fingers curled around his, he realized that trust was not the risk he once thought it was. It was the only way to truly live. Their kiss in that room was different from the ones before. It wasn't born from anger or defiance, but from surrender. It was the quiet acknowledgement that love had become their code, the one unbreakable system that neither had designed, but both had found themselves bound to. From then on, everything changed. Their story was no longer about intrusion or defense, but about creation. Together they began to build, not just programs or systems, but a life. She brought imagination where he brought structure. He brought security where she brought freedom. Their differences, once weapons in their battles, became the very foundation of their unity. And slowly the world began to notice. The brilliant magnate no longer walked with the same solitary weight. The anonymous hacker was no longer just a shadow behind a screen. Together, they became something unexpected, something powerful. Not because of the systems they built, but because of the love that had grown between them. On the anniversary of the day she had breached his system, he surprised her. A private dinner, candles flickering against glass walls that overlooked the city. And when she teased him about how sentimental he had become, he only smiled, slid a small device across the table, and said, "Open it." It was a sleek tablet, its screen blank except for a line of code. Curious, she typed in a sequence, her fingers instinctively finding the rhythm. As the code unfolded, she gasped. It wasn't a program, not really. It was a message, written in the language they both understood best. Every line of the script spelled out the story of their beginning, her breach, his anger, their battles, their surrender. And at the very end, a simple phrase appeared in glowing letters. "Will you write the rest of the code with me?" Her eyes filled with tears, her laugh breaking through the emotion. "You're proposing with a program?" He leaned closer, his voice soft but steady. "With the only language I know you'll never misinterpret." Her answer was a kiss, fierce and certain. A kiss that said yes without needing words. And so the magnate who had once trusted nothing but machines found his forever not in firewalls or algorithms, but in the heart of the girl who had dared to breach them. Their love was imperfect, unpredictable, sometimes chaotic, but it was theirs. A code no one else could write, no one else could break. A code of love.